Hey bead friends, this is Lauren Harpster from Bead and Blossom. I am the designer, author, and instructor at Bead and Blossom, and today I am continuing with my intermediate techniques series. In this series, we're going to be learning how to build on top of and alter the techniques that I taught in my beginner course. If you are not familiar with the beginner level techniques, I will have a link in the description where you can find that playlist. I will also have a link in the description to where you can download a free PDF packet of the intermediate techniques that was made to go along with this video series. This video is lesson 1 part 2, where we're going to be learning even more about extensions. The first video in lesson 1 talked about top wire extensions on a basic frame, and in this video we're going to be learning about bottom wire extensions. I'll be just showing you 2 different methods for making bottom wire extensions on a basic frame, and then we're also going to be learning how to do bottom wire extensions with continuous techniques like continuous wraparound loops or continuous basic frame, which we will learn later in this series. The sample pattern that we're going to be working with today for this demonstration is an 11-row basic frame, 8-bead basic row with a pointed bottom and round top. We will add 5 beads to the bottom wire after row 7, and then we will reduce to 2 bottom wires. Alright, so to set up our basic frame, I've got 8 beads counted out for my basic row, and I'm going to move those near the top. And then I've got 5 beads for my bottom wire extension, and I'm going to put them in the bottom loop. Now, just like the top wire extensions, you can add this later. I just like to do it now so that I don't forget. Alright, so we're going to set up our frame as normal, but we're going to put those 5 beads in the bottom loop. Alright, then we're going to wrap rows 2 through 7 with a pointed bottom and round top. Alright, so I've made my rows through row 7, and at this point I actually need to remove my working wire. This is what differentiates this method from the second one that I'm going to be showing you here in a bit. We need to remove this working wire so we can put our extension beads up. But we're not going to wrap it off normal. If I double wrapped right here, as we normally would when we're tying off a working wire, then we get this little coil of beads right below that last row of beads. And it forms a little collar there, right around those 2 little double bottom wires. And it ends up being very visible in the petal. So I'm going to show you something else instead. What we're going to do is cut a tiny little tail of that working wire. Put a little loop in the end of the wire that's still attached to your spool so your beads don't fall off. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to weave it up along the bottom wire that we've already wrapped around. So we're going to weave it up between rows. So we're going to bring that wire around like we were going to wrap it again, but instead we're going to bring it up between these 2 rows on the right side of my little petal and then pull it through. I'm going to grab some pliers to help me with this. Pull it through. And then we're going to go back down, not between these 2 rows, but down below that row. Just like that. And that's going to help to keep our little working wire so it's not visible, but it is tied off and secure. So once we're at the back side of the leaf, we can just cut off that working wire. If there's a little stub sticking out there, you can use your pliers to pinch that down again. Alright, so we've got our working wire taken care of, and now we need to open up our bottom loop to get those extension beads up. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to detach one of these wires, but we're going to take a look at these wires first before we decide which one we're going to detach. There should be one of them that is a little bit further in front of the other. Do you see how this one that I've already got my beads on, let me pull those off, is kind of sitting a little bit above this other little wire? We're going to put the beads onto the wire that is above, and we're going to clip the wire that is below. That'll make it so that that clipped wire can be hidden and won't be exposed, and then our beads will be up right on top and should be a little bit more in line with the petal, with the rows that are already in the petal. Now at this point, we're going to reattach our working wire right below that extension. So I'm going to cross, this is the end of my working wire here that's got my beads on it. And I'm going to cross it over the bottom just as if it were another basic row. And I am going to leave a little bit of a tail down there below so I have enough space to make a little tail wire. All right, so I'm going to cross over pointing this direction. I want it to cross over that bottom wire pointing the same direction that I'm going to start wrapping my first rows. And you do want to continue going around the same direction that you were wrapping rows before. So I've got it crossing over that bottom wire pointing right. That way, when I start adding my rows, I can actually cover that bottom wire entirely. If my working wire here is behind, so if I had for some reason felt like I needed to go this way, which you shouldn't do, but when your working wire is behind, you can't get those beads on top of that bottom wire, and so you get a little bit more exposure there with that bottom wire. So always cross over the front if you can of that bottom wire. Now, just like the top wire extensions, we're going to mold our new row around the extension before we wrap the row. Because if we just wrapped the row normally and then went back and tried to pinch, we might not have enough slack in the row to be able to mold it nicely around that extension. So I'm going to recommend that you mold around the extension first as you're wrapping your row up to that top wire. All right, double check it, make sure your row is nice, and then wrap row 8. And then we're going to do the same thing with row 9 down to the bottom wire. We're going to pinch and mold around that extension before we wrap. Make sure everything's nice and straight. And if you need to, you can kind of hold that extension in place and then wrap at the bottom wire. That's row 9. I've got 2 more to go. So again, I'm going to pinch and mold my wire around as I'm going around my petal. And I do this little thing with my hands. I don't know if you've ever seen me do this in my video before, if I've ever talked about it, but I do this little clamp with my fingers where I kind of pinch around my petal like this, and that helps me to help keep these rows kind of in line and flat and in place while I'm measuring out my rows. All right, there's row 11. That's going to be my last row, so I can tie off my working wire. And then I can cut my petal off of my spool, and we're reducing to 2 bottom wires, so I can just cut off that working wire right there, right where I've tied it off. All right, finish up that top wire by cutting it short and then folding it to the back of the petal. Right, so that is the first method for making a bottom wire extension on a basic frame. The sample pattern that we'll be working with for this portion of the video is going to be a 9-row basic frame, 10 bead basic row with a pointed bottom and round top, and then we will add 5 beads to the bottom wire after row 6 and then reduce to 2 bottom wires. Now again, we're going to start with constructing our basic frame. And I am going to put my my bottom wire extension beads in my loop before I start. All right, so I've got my 10 beads that I need for my basic row. I've got 5 beads for my bottom wire extension, and I'm going to set up my basic frame the same way I normally would, but with those 5 beads inside the bottom loop. All right, now we're going to wrap rows 2 through 6. Notice that I'm wrapping through an even number of rows this time instead of odd. That allows us to do the bottom wire extension without having to cut and reattach our working wire. All right, so there's row 6, and I'm going to stop right there at the top wire, okay, because that's row 6, and we don't want to make row 7 until we've got our bottom wire extension in place. So if you have any twists in your bottom wire, we're going to need to untwist them. Now again, you need to look at these wires in your bottom loop carefully to decide which of these wires is more in front of the other one. This wire up here is more in front, so I'm going to put my beads onto that wire. And then the second wire is actually going to come behind those top wire extension beads. So let me flip over so you can see what I'm doing here. All right, I'm looking at the back of my petal, and I want to make sure that this second wire goes behind those bottom wire extension beads. So lay it as flat as you can. And then we're going to grab and pinch and hold that top wire extension bead nice and taut so it stays really tight against the bottom of our petal. And then we're going to twist those 2 wires right below those extension beads. All right, and again, I'm going to make sure that that wire is sitting behind the beads and not beside them. So you should look like this. And then I can wrap row 7 right below that extension. Okay, mold that row nicely around the extension before you wrap as you're measuring the row. Row 7, and then row 8. Mold nicely around that extension. And our final row is row 9 in this pattern. All right, now we can reduce to 2 bottom wires the same way we always would, just by clipping off that working wire right below where we've tied it off. And then we can open up our bottom loop, cut that top wire short, and fold it back. All right, and there we have a bottom wire extension without having to cut and reattach our working wire. The sample pattern that we'll be working with is 2 4-row continuous wraparound loops with a pointed bottom, and we're going to be using 15 beads for the starting loop. We will add 3 beads to the bottom wire after the second row. Now, when you're doing continuous techniques with bottom wire extensions, you do need to have the bottom wire extensions on the bottom wire before you do the petal. You won't have the option of being able to remove anything, cut anything open, because it's continuous. Now, the exception is the first petal. If you forgot on the first petal, you can just undo the loop when you're ready to add that extension. But for all the other following petals, you do have to have it on before you start making your rows. All right, so we need a 15 bead starting loop. I'll leave my little tail wire, and those 3 bottom wire extension beads are on my tail wire. And I'm going to make my starting loop. All right, so I've got my starting loop and 3 little beads for the bottom wire extension already on there. And we're going to wrap row 2 around that starting loop, as our pattern said that we're going to add those top wire extensions after row 2. So I'm going to wrap row 2 at the bottom wire. Now at this point I actually am forced to start row 3. So the bottom wire extension is actually going to be added kind of right in the middle of row 3 before we end row 3. All right, so I'm going to kind of start wrapping row 3 around and then move those 3 beads in my bottom wire down right below the petal. And I'm going to carefully mold row 3 around. Mold it around those bottom wire extensions and then wrap right below the extension, just like we did on the basic frame version. And then we're going to wrap the 4th row of beads around. Make sure that you are carefully molding your rows around that extension so you get a nice tight fit. And then double wrap at the bottom to finish off your petal. All right, now for the second one, again, we need to have those 3 extension beads on the bottom wire before we make our starting loop. So add those 3 beads down now. Count out 15 beads for the second starting loop. And we're going to measure the distance required to make all those wraps in the bottom loop. And you need to include your bottom wire extension in that. So I usually just eyeball the distance just by pulling up my beads right beside my first petal and estimating the distance below my starting loop of the first petal to the bottom of the petal and then add a tiny smidge extra. All right, so I'm going to hold that in place and then make my starting loop way up there. Wrap row 2. This wire I'm working with feels more like 22 gauge wire and it's not cooperating quite as nicely. All right, so I've wrapped row 2 and we're ready for row 3. So right in the middle of row 3, I'm going to kind of nudge those 3 bottom wire extension beads down and wrap row 3 right below that bottom wire extension. And then finally we will wrap row 4. Yeah, what is wrong with this wire? Mold the row carefully, and I am pinching and holding all my rows in place, and then wrapping twice to finish off that second petal. Now if you had more petals, you would just continue on making more petals as required for your pattern, but just for the sample, we're just going to make 2. Alrighty, bead friends, that completes our extension lessons. Next time I'm going to be continuing my intermediate technique series, and we're going to be learning about the continuous basic frame, which is making multiple basic frame petals all on a single length of wire. Until next time, happy beading!